Oh,
with
that's great.
Anu, which was wild. He like emailed over like a list of the cuisine he wanted. Like he had a list of things that um, my husband had. No, no. Um, but he would like at tea time and stuff like talk about the very first things. And I don't know if he had us over for dinner a couple of times, and was like, you know, there was like an order measure. No, so he was like, I want this. All right, I'm on it. Yeah, yeah. So how did you like it? Yeah.
afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session on building the case for access to justice. Just to remind all of you that there are parallel sessions, and if you are interested in other topics which are happening in, being addressed in parallel, yes, I'd like to draw your attention to the screen behind me, which sets out the places and no longer, but which sets out the places and the topics for other breakout sessions, including on small and medium enterprises. And I know that some of you mentioned that this was of interest to you. So if you feel that you would like to be somewhere else, no offense will be taken. So that's an opportunity right now. But for those of you who are interested in the findings of the OECD work on making the case for investment or building the case for access to justice, yes, we welcome you to this breakout session, and we are seated in a bit stiff manner, so it really looks like a big panel, but in fact the idea for this session is to really stimulate dialogue and have an interactive discussion with all of you. And you may remember that when we started this work a number of years ago, many of you have asked the OECD to start thinking about the business case for access to justice. So why would the state, the government invest in justice? How to help you make the case for investment? So we've listened and we've partnered with many institutions that you can see being represented at this table to see what we can put forward as the business case. And I'd like to actually stress that we are just scratching the surface, and this is the beginning of the thinking, and we certainly would welcome your feedback and your reactions to our findings. So basically the purpose of today's discussion is to reflect on the findings of kind of preliminary business case for investing in access to justice, but then also to consider what could be possible next steps. So we will begin with the overview of the findings, and I will invite our colleague Reza to present the case in much greater detail. But then this will be followed by 3 mini sessions focusing on 3 topics. So first is what could be the next steps in measuring the costs of lack of access. Second is how can we also taking the discussion on measuring benefits of different access to justice interventions to another level. So you may have seen in the paper that we identified quite a bit of evidence around 4 types of interventions on the benefits of investment in those areas, but how can we take it to another level? And then finally, how can we reflect on potential indicators, both at the global and national level, that would do due justice to the importance and complexity of the issue of access to civil justice. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague and senior advisor to the OECD, Reza Laiji, to present the main findings of the paper, and then we will proceed with the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Is there a pointer or something for the slides? Is there anyone who knows if there is a pointer? Oh, great.
Here we go. That was the first part of the test.
Yeah. So far so good. Great. Thank you very much. So after 1.5 days already of extremely interesting and dense discussions, which I guess your minds must be a bit saturated now, and with now full stomachs as well, we feel that you're fully ready for a long presentation with a lot of statistics. But please bear with me, because some of this stuff is actually interesting. And just to tell you a little bit about the process, this work started in earnest, because it's been a very long process, but the work on the paper started in earnest about 9 months ago. So it feels a little bit like giving birth, with this feeling of exhaustion and happiness. And the analogy goes even further, because this too has been, as Tatiana said, a collaborative effort. So a lot of people, including in this room and in the other rooms, have participated in it. And when you look at the result, you can think, you know, oh, this feature makes me think of Jeff, for instance, or Alejandro, or Trevor, or others. This is not by accident. It's actually, they are also the parents of this child. Basically, as Tatiana said, the aim was to make a business case, and by this we mean first and foremost a figure, right? So what kind of figure can we put in front of access to justice or lack of access to justice to try to make the case? But I think even as economists and statisticians, we realize that, you know, one figure cannot do everything, and sometimes a little bit of qualitative knowledge also helps. So it is much more broadly about, you know, understanding what are the kind of effects that lack of access to justice is having, what kind of benefits improving access to justice can have, and feed all of that into a process of advocacy for investments in access to justice. Couple of words on the methodology and scope of this paper. It has to be clear from the onset that, you know, this is limited to civil and administrative justice, not criminal, and that the whole approach adheres largely to this whole idea of people centricity that has been, you know, a thread going through all the discussions here. This in particular means if you're interested in access to justice from the standpoint of people, you're kind of automatically driven to putting a lot of emphasis on those people, those categories of people who have challenges in accessing justice. So I will actually make a number of references to inequalities of access to justice and not simply in overall figures. What we're doing here is to approach access to justice from the standpoint of unmet legal needs. And that is not neutral, and I will come back to it in my conclusion. But basically, the idea is that, well, access to justice is a capability, right? So it's people's capability in activating this, upholding their substantive rights. And as a capability, you cannot really observe it, you cannot really measure it. So what has become the main method for approaching access to justice is to see what it means in practice in people's everyday lives. And that means when people meet a problem that has a legal nature, what access do they have to justice institutions to help them with that problem? The whole notions that enable you to approach this issue have now been well established in the literature. So legal problems are well defined, and then from there we move on to, you know, what is the ability of people in dealing with these problems? What is their legal capability? And legal capabilities vary from person to person, and where the capability of people in dealing with this problem stops, that is where their legal need starts. And justice institutions can go away in meeting these needs or not meeting these needs. And it is the notion of unmet legal needs, so the gap between people's legal capability and the supply that they meet to help them resolve their problem that defines the lack of access to justice. We have an instrument that helps us actually assess these notions, which is the legal needs surveys. that have become extremely widespread in many countries. And some institutions do a lot of work in trying to establish a common methodology and to run these surveys in a variety of countries. I think the Hague Institute for Innovation and Law is one that deserves to be mentioned here, and our partner, the World Justice Project, is another one. The World Justice Project in 2017 ran a standardized survey on legal needs in 45 countries. It's being extended now to a greater number of countries, but that is primarily the data that we used in this work, and all of the statistical analysis that I will show you comes from that survey. This being said, we try to have a broader base and look at the findings of all legal needs surveys and to try to come up with robust conclusions from this whole literature. And actually, a lot of the findings are consistent. So when you do a survey in one country and then you do another survey with a slightly different methodology in the same country, the type of findings that you have are strikingly similar. So statistically, at least, the method is well established and robust. This being said, it also has limitations, and I'll come to it. The second part of my presentation and of the working paper is about, okay, so what is it we can do really about these unmet legal needs? And there we reviewed the literature on the effectiveness, efficiency, and larger benefits of various forms of interventions all along the range of services that we consider from a people-centric standpoint. So it's definitely not only the judiciary, but a much broader range of services, including legal empowerment, legal information, and so on. So a couple of words of caution with the whole approach. I think particularly when it comes to legal needs surveys, we need to keep in mind that these are surveys. So they ask people about their personal experience, and they rely on people's willingness and ability to report on these experiences. So by nature, the information is subjective. And in particular, this entails a problem which is very classical in social science, which is the problem of causal attribution. So when I will talk here about the consequences of legal problems, or the burden of legal problems, or even the impact of legal problems, this is as seen from the people themselves, which is by no means a rigorous way of testing whether actually it's the legal problem that caused these effects. So here we will only rely on people's own assessment of what have been the consequences for them. An additional important caveat is that, of course, people are, in a certain institutional, legal, more broadly institutional, political, cultural context. So what they understand by what is a problem, what is their capability, what are the institutions that can answer to their problems, depends enormously from country to country. So please do not make any comparisons between countries in the graphs that I will show you. It's totally meaningless, and we're not trying to do this. We're not trying to establish rankings or anything of the sort, but rather to see what are the robust findings that actually work in a lot of different contexts, and that is we feel meaningful information. A lot of these limitations apply to the part of my presentation that will be about legal needs surveys, but then the literature on the benefits of interventions, we try to focus on studies that address a number of these issues. So the information there is rather objective, it's rather hard and reliable. Causal attribution in most of the studies that I will refer to has been rigorously established by experimental methods and so on. A lot of these problems do not apply, but context dependence still applies. And a particular problem that I will mention is that essentially this literature is concentrated in high-income countries, and in particular the United States. So, 3/4, 80% of the literature comes from the United States. What it means really in a broader context remains to be addressed, and that will be a question for the panel that will talk in particular about this. So let me now, with all of these words of introduction now, walk you through some of the findings finally. Well, our finding number one is that what we call justiciable problems, sorry, another word of introduction. What is justiciable problem? Is a problem of significant seriousness that people have reported. So people are asked whether they have faced problems of various sorts, and to report also on the level of seriousness. And then you filter for problems that are considered to be fairly easy, trivial, because these are probably not related to significant legal needs. And the rest that we keep here and that I will tell you about is called a justiciable problem. So when you focus on these problems as they are reported in legal needs surveys, what you typically find is that in most countries, 40%, 50% of the population in the past couple of years have experienced at least one problem of this sort. So it's considerable. It's everyday problems for everyday people, for basically all of us. Another very robust and interesting finding is that these problems are unevenly distributed in the population. This has been said a number of times these 2 days. This is some evidence on it. And if we talk about a finding that is robust across countries and levels of income and cultural backgrounds, there you go. So this is basically the difference in prevalence between people who live on public benefits and the rest of the population. And you see that in almost all countries in the sample, people who live on public benefits have more, and sometimes considerably more, justiciable problems than the rest of the population. This applies also, I will not show it here, but it applies also to unemployed people as opposed to people who have a job and an occupation. It applies to lower income as opposed to higher income people, and so on and so forth. So it can be taken as a general finding that people from disadvantaged group of the population usually face more problems and more severe problems, more serious problems also than the rest of the population. Now, when you ask people about what these problems have meant for them in terms of practical consequences, very often people associate the problems with quite harsh impacts and burdens. One example is people who declare that because of their justiciable problems, they have lost their job or lost income opportunities. And you see here that in most countries, 25, 30, 35% of people report that they have experienced such an impact. One interesting finding is that if you compare the blue bars and the red bars, these are differentiated according to whether people's problem was eventually resolved or whether it hasn't been resolved. And pending problems are left aside. So this is really about, a settlement process has taken place. Has it resolved the issue or not? What you find is that in almost all cases, there is much more impact on people's income, employment situation for problems that have not been resolved. Another type of impact that is particularly interesting is exposure to violence. So here we look at the experience of violence either in the context of a justiciable problem or as a consequence of the justiciable problem. And what we see is again that in 15, 20, 25% of cases, which is enormous when you have in mind the prevalence of these problems, there is actually an experience of violence as part of the justiciable problem. And you see again that in almost all cases, exposure is higher for problems that are not resolved than when they are resolved. Now, taking these type of consequences, we try to come with an estimate of what it meant in terms of cost. So this is the kind of figure, business case figure that we were looking for. Unfortunately, there is almost no legal needs surveys where this question is explicitly asked. What are the type of costs that you have had? There is one case that we found that provides this information, and it's a pleasure to have the lead author of that survey at this table. So the Canadian survey that was conducted a few years ago actually tells us, okay, on average, people spent, in 2012 in Canada, they spent 6,000 Canadian dollars as an expenditures that were directly related to solving their problems. So we're talking about lawyer fees, about court fees, about transportation costs, and so on and so forth. It also told us when people tell us that they have lost their job because of a legal problem, they have been on unemployment benefits for an average of 21 weeks. And it also tells us a little bit about the medical costs that they say that they have incurred because of the illness that they have experienced as a consequence of their problem. So we took these assumptions, and these assumptions are already conservative as presented by the study, and we added a conservative tweak to them. So for instance, using the World Justice Project data, the survey asks people whether they had challenges in funding the expenditures that help them address their case. And people say, it was difficult to fund the expenditures, it was almost impossible, or it was easy, or it was somewhat easy. And we took the people who found it difficult or almost impossible, and to them we applied this standard cost, which is 1 month of their income, which comes from the Canadian survey. And when they say that it was somewhat easy, we apply half of that, and when they say that it was easy, we apply 0. And we think that since the Canadian survey was giving this as an average cost, well, what we get is obviously a conservative estimate. Similarly, when people say that they have lost their employment, we consider that it represents 1 month of their income, when the Canadian survey was telling us that it was actually that they were 5 months on average on unemployment insurance. And we also compute the illness cost. And this is the result that we get when we extrapolate to all of the population. We divide by 2 because these are problems that have been faced over 2 years. So we calculate an annual cost in proportion to the GDP. And this conservative, we feel quite conservative estimate still amounts to 0.5, 1%, 2% of GDP in many countries, including OECD countries. And this is the cost that you get here. So even for just these 3 categories of costs, and with these assumptions, it is a level of cost for society as a whole that is considerable. We move on. So these are basically people's legal problems and their consequences. Now, what's the capability and what's the type of service that they get? When you simply ask people, do you know where to get good quality information on how to deal with your problem? What you see is that basically 30–40% of people in most countries do not know even where to get information. So a lot of people do not have legal capability. There is also strong inequalities in terms of legal capability. So when we look at differences of impact between groups, we find important disparities. The same applies to legal assistance. So when you look on average, what share of people get legal assistance, what you find is typically 15–20% who face justiciable problems. Only 15 or 20% get assistance from a professional source. And then when you look at the distribution, what you see is presented here. So all the left side of the chart is countries in which higher income people get more professional assistance than lower income. And you see that, you know, basically apart from a few exceptions, it's always the case. And it can be very substantial differences in access between high income people and low income people. We move on from there to what people do, and what we find is also a consistent finding of the literature is that most cases people don't do anything. And these are the cases where people engage a settlement process either by making a complaint, a formal complaint, going to the police, going to a court, and so on, or through other means, religious leaders, dispute settlement processes, alternative dispute settlement, and so on and so forth. And putting all of this together, you see that in most countries, it is still less than 15% of justiciable problems in which people actually act. And finally, when we look at what is the rate of resolution of these justiciable problems, and furthermore, to what extent they have been considered satisfactory by people, and in particular, do people consider that the whole process was fair, independent of the outcome? We even further reduce the share, and so here you see that in most countries, less than 10% or less than 20% of justiciable problems end up being resolved in a way that was considered fair by the respondent. So if this is our idea of what a met legal need is, then a large fraction of legal needs are unmet. But just recapping on the various findings, we see that even if we have broader acceptance of the idea of unmet legal needs in terms of capability, assistance, and so on and so forth, in general, a majority of the legal problems, the justiciable problems that people meet correspond to unmet legal needs. So coming now to the second part of my presentation, what is it we can do about it? There is an important strand of literature, of empirical literature applied to justice problems that has developed in the past 20 years, and we have some of the contributors also at this table, and it has made important findings. For instance, it has shown that legal representation is very important in most cases, but it's quite inefficient in some cases. So, it is important, you have to invest in it, but you have to target it where it's actually needed. So this is one important finding. Legal aid is needed, full legal representation is needed, but in cases that are complex with people who have multiple problems and low capability. To address problems of access to public services, to welfare systems, administrative systems, it's probably not a good idea to invest in full representation. And you have a range of so-called unbundled legal services that have appeared that enable to have more targeted support to people and help them with these more simple or simpler cases and people who have higher levels of capability maybe. Also, there is evidence that ADR mechanisms can be quite efficient and cost-effective ways to respond to people's and businesses' needs, provided that a number of conditions are observed, and in particular in terms of willingness to participate and the balance of powers between the two sides of the case. We have strong evidence that the use of technology, many examples were given here today, can be extremely effective. Video courtrooms enabling people to access from a distance, lawyers to access from a distance are an example. Digitalization is obviously an example. Court modernization efforts, as the ones that were presented in the case of Portugal, for instance, important reforms, go a long way in making courts that are more efficient, have reduced backlogs, more time. But then the assumption is that these resources that are freed up are actually reinvested in increasing access to justice. So efficiency gains do not necessarily automatically lead to improved access to justice, but they create the possibility. And finally, court specialization. There is quite a bit of evidence that when it is cost effective, and that requires a substantial number of important cases, but when that is the case, then it is absolutely effective. So this was in terms of, we know that it is well established. We have evidence that services, legal justice services, can go a long way in reducing this global burden that I was talking about. Now, zooming in on particular groups of the population that concentrate a lot of these problems, we also have evidence that there is practical manners that help to address the legal needs of these groups of population. In situations of vulnerability, legal representation is absolutely needed and very effective in, for instance, avoiding house evictions. When full representation is not available, specialized assistance, community legal centers have been shown to be quite effective and to have benefits that largely overweigh their costs. Also, increasingly, there is an idea of integrating assistance between health services and justice services, employment and justice services, education, and so on and so forth. And these have been proven to be effective. It remains, however, that in the case of these populations who have multiple needs, addressing their broader problems is a challenge, and often the results that we see in the literature point to targeted benefits. House eviction was avoided, but then in the longer term, we're not sure how far we have gone in avoiding exclusion. A third category of benefits that we were able to document is in the prevention of violence and the reduction of the costs that are related to violence. And I'm going to be a little faster on this because it is well documented that increasingly integrated services of assistance to the victims of violence, but also to the perpetrators of violence, help deal with a lot of the long-term costs of violence, and these long-term costs are increasingly well understood. Also, restorative approaches, courts that specifically deal with issues of violence in relation to drugs, in relation to mental issues, have been shown to be quite effective. And finally, still going from the more narrow to the broader, there is a very interesting strand of evidence on the fact that access to justice interventions, and in particular empowerment interventions, lead to better governance and to better law, to institutional reform, to legal reform in the long term. There are very interesting experiences in various parts of the world that show that literacy campaigns, legal advice, and so on can, for instance, help tackle issues of injustice or corruption at local level. And these issues affect, in particular, justice services themselves. For instance, informal justice services that are not submitted to the same controls and separation of powers and so on and so forth, independence requirements, as formal justice services are, very often are plagued by these issues of who has power locally and who knows whom, and what is the traditional sharing of responsibilities, powers, and influence between men and women, for instance. Well, in such cases, paralegals have been able to change a lot of things on the ground. This is of particular interest in situations where there is a change that is made in the substantive law, in the formal law, and in which new rights are created. For instance, equality of treatment between men and women. These legislative changes can remain purely theoretical, purely formal, and lead just to an important gap between what the law says and the way in which law is implemented. And in fact, legal empowerment is the tool that really enables to activate these rights on the ground, and there are very interesting examples of this. And finally, there are examples where these movements have even led to constitutional change, to a lot of interesting and far-reaching legal reforms, particularly where there was a willingness to open for this and to build on these agents of change at the higher level. So this advocates for joint reform-oriented interventions, both from the center and at the local level. So these are the types of benefits that are documented in the white paper. I'm just going to conclude with a word about the limitations of this work. I've already told you a bit about the inherent limitations of surveys. That's a lot of the information that we use, and also about the uneven basis of evidence that we have. We build on the existing literature, and the existing literature is largely concentrated in terms of its geographical scope. But I wanted to end on a little bit of thinking on what is it, how is it we're approaching access to justice. And I said that so the agreed way to do this is through legal needs. If we take the definitions of the two terms, so access to justice is basically what capacity, what capability people have to enforce their rights. Unmet legal need is quite different. Is what capability people have to solve their everyday problems, and to what extent their need in this regard is matched by adequate assistance. So there is a difference in scope between the two notions that is quite important. Part of it has been identified and addressed by work that the World Justice Project is currently doing on the justice gap, trying to map what is the overall situation when it comes to access to justice, and they make basically three categories. They say, okay, there are extreme cases of lack of access to justice, which are when justice institutions are non-existent or systematically failing. Then obviously, all of this does not apply to that. Then there are cases where such institutions are existing and functioning more or less properly, but the law itself does not provide coverage to certain people. when people do not have legal identity, for instance, or when they work in the informal sector, they have no access to some of the protections that the law provides. So this also comes in addition. And then they identify still further a third category, which is cases where institutions exist, they function, the law provides protection, but it's not very effective in going towards meeting people's needs. And that is where unmet legal needs have a meaning. Knowing, of course, that then there are criminal needs and civil needs, and we only talked about civil needs. So when you put it back in the broader picture of access to justice, you see that we're only covering a tiny bit. So this is in terms of scope. When we go a little further and we ask, even within this limited coverage, what we're trying to do, if you want to really assess what it means not to have access to justice, you should do it in what economists call in terms of opportunity cost, which means that you should go to people and what you should ask them is, had you had the ability to enforce all of your rights, what would have been your experience? And how does that experience compare to your actual experience? The difference is the real cost of lack of access to justice. And we see that what we're capturing is really a tiny fraction of that, because we cannot ask people, if you had from your birth been able to enforce all of your rights, what would have been your life, obviously. The problem goes even a little further if you think that what matters is eventually the social cost of lack of access to justice. So not the cost to every particular individual, but to society at large. In societies where, for instance, freedom of speech does not really exist, it is very unlikely that individuals who are asked in the context of a legal needs survey will see this as an individual legal problem. It is not a legal problem for them because it's a problem for society in general. In cases where women have been systematically discriminated, it is likely that they do not see this as an individual legal problem, but that is a more defining problem for society. So the opportunity cost for society is probably largely bigger than the sum of individual opportunity costs, which we still underestimate. So this is all to say that these calculations that we made are, as Tatiana said, a starting point. We're scratching the surface, and we're only beginning to understand what are the costs of lack of access to justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. And as I mentioned, that we have 3 mini panels scheduled for the rest of the session. However, I actually would like to give everyone an opportunity to ask a question about the specific findings of the paper, because we underscored all of its limitations, and that the analysis is done not for the purpose of comparison across the countries, but really to equip us with findings that can help us understand the significance of the cost. But yes, please, Natalie.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that brilliant presentation. I'm so pleased that you've done this work. I wondered, in the course of the research, at the foundation that I work for, we're particularly interested in evidence behind effective legal literacy campaigns. Evidence behind effective legal literacy campaigns. Did the research uncover any evidence of sort of best practice in how to conduct that? The other question that I had was on ADR and the safeguards that you rightly identify around it's effective in cases where there's parity of power. But in reality, how often is that the case? And how might we measure or capture inequalities in power in a way that could guide, for example, policymakers who are looking to scale up ADR as an approach for particular areas? Thank you.
Are there any other questions so that we collect?
I had a question about the court specialization. If I understood you correctly, that you found that where there is a big volume of cases, it has beneficial effects. It improves access to justice. If you could a little bit explain more what, based on what was that conclusion, I would, if you can, yeah.
Just one question I have. It seems quite a big leap to go from individual costs to individuals around things like employment and costs of taking legal actions and stuff to talk about cost to society. Cost to society will go far beyond the cost to individuals. One example that strikes in my head, for example, is that if it is slow to sell and buy a house, or if there are disputes around the sale of property, that can have quite a big economic cost that would probably not get captured in any survey of individuals in any real way. Because you'd still be in employment, but you might be renting, or you know what I mean? Is that kind of cost? So is there any way of trying to capture that broader societal cost, or are there any models out there of looking at that?
Excellent questions. I'd like to invite Reza, but then also the rest of the panel, maybe to briefly reflect on any of those.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great questions, which I mean, in part address some of the limitations of this work. It's so broad that it wasn't possible to address any of this in detail. And I would not want to preempt on the discussions in the panels that are going to precisely be about these kind of things. But just in a couple of words, I think on court specialization, I mean the notion is simply that it is very costly. It is very costly to. I mean, in many cases, courts are already addressing are already experiencing inadequate resources, and to start specializing is costly. So, so what we've seen is that the cases in which it is considered that the benefits outweigh the costs are the cases in which there were at least enough caseload to keep the specialized courts busy. In terms of ADR systems and of I think your other question was about legal education. I think what we've covered in the paper is a fairly limited base of evidence. So I would not to venture into very specific conclusions, but I think we can come back to it in the panel. But there is many of these interesting and emerging areas for which the basis of evidence is still quite limited. In terms of the social costs, absolutely. What I was referring to is basically that when we look at legal needs surveys and focus on legal problems and what people see as legal problems, we're already probably missing a lot of the issues. What you are referring to is additional knock-on effects, so indirect consequences. There are direct consequences that are mentioned here, but of course there are indirect consequences. This whole methodology is not adapted for addressing all of these issues, but there are other ways. There is a large literature on the rule of law and its relation to economic development, the whole concept of rule of law has not really addressed access to justice. So this is probably an important area for research to see, to what extent a reasonable indicator of access to justice would correlate with levels of economic growth and development. That would be more the approach that I could see than this kind of survey-based approaches.
Yes, please.
So sorry, one quick follow-up. As a funder of research, What are the types of research or evidence that you would like to see funded in this space, and where can interested research funders fill gaps that are missing that you've identified in this report?
That's actually really the question that takes us to the discussion in the panels, because in fact the big objective of today's session is to look at the next steps and what kind of research, what kind of evidence, what kind of thinking we need to generate in order to be able to strengthen the case for investment. And I hope that we'll be able, as a result of this panel, to more precisely answer this question, because this is so important. This is also the reason why we are bringing together such a diverse set of participants coming from the academia, from the research think tanks, from the governments that have been investing in this, and also looking at it from the both economic perspective as well social and justice. So, and hopefully this multidisciplinary approach and also multi-stakeholder approach can help us come up with an answer that would do due justice to what actually can be and should be the next step and where the investments should go. So, with this, I'd like to go to the next panel on what could be the next steps in measuring the costs of lack of access. And here, again, the emphasis in the lack of access. And we have three knowledgeable speakers in this panel. The first one is Alejandro Pons, who is the Chief Research Officer from the World Justice Project. And Reza already mentioned that Alejandro is leading an international effort in trying to quantify what is the justice gap together with the pathfinders for peaceful, just and inclusive societies. Then, of course, we also have Trevor Farrow, who is a professor and associate dean the Oecd Hall Law School in Canada, chair Canadian Forum on Civil Justice. And we also have Reza, who already presented the findings of the paper to also reflect on this question. And just to remind that we have three main questions for this panel, but also kind of reflecting more broadly on what is the extent of the justice gap in both OECD, but then also all of the partner countries. What is the evidence that we know of, but also that we need to continue developing to start understanding what are the consequences of the lack of access, and then also what could actually be real concrete next steps, building on all of the work that is currently being done in measuring this cost. So where could we go next, building on the current findings? So with this, I'd like to invite Alejandro and to remind that each of you have about 5 minutes max. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana and Reza, just for presenting this. I will just present some big ideas so that we can have a conversation. So first, I think to praise you for the report. I think something that this is a report that is needed for the field. And the fact that the OECD is producing it is quite useful. So there has been some literature in the legal field, but the fact of bringing this research to the sphere of inclusive growth, economic development, and so on is quite important. So I congratulate you on that. And I think it's important because thus far, we have been thinking in silos almost. So just until very recently, and I think this paper really takes the first step in which we start thinking about what are the implications of having or not having access to justice for the welfare of people in general, beyond the outcome that they may have just for the particular problem. What is the implication in general in their lives? So people face problems, and these problems, they may not necessarily categorize them as justice problems, but they affect their lives in many different ways, and we have to start making efforts to understand them. And importantly, in that in that process to make the case for investing in justice. We cannot make the case that justice is important if we don't understand the consequences that justice have beyond the courts, beyond the processes. So it's important to understand in general why this matters. Now, we have been moving in the last few years, right? So now we are talking about people-centered justice, and all the different conversations that we have had in the last couple of days are around that. Even if it's just from institutions, for organizations, but essentially we are putting the people at the center. So I think that is definitely a shift that we are seeing. We're not talking much more about institutions, but we're talking about people, how institutions can respond to people. So then the timing is right for starting to have these conversations. On top of that, just the environment, of talking about inclusive growth and SDGs help in this movement. Now, talking about in particularly, I think this paper just brings the first step towards answering this question. But just thinking about what we need to move forward, if we want to push this paper forward to a broader research agenda. So what are the kind of things that we should be thinking about, or that I think that we should be thinking about? So the first one is the scope. I think Reza talked about this, so that the paper is centered on civil and administrative needs. But I think in general, just people experience justice, or lack of access to justice in many other different ways. I mean, in many cases, they cannot realize the rights. They don't necessarily know that they have a problem to begin with, just because they simply, as Reza was saying, we're doing a work on expanding this idea of justice beyond just simply having a problem and trying to resolve it. So just can we think as well of all the different aspects that people need in order to realize their rights and to enforce their rights, without necessarily that the problem arises and then they solve it. Just there are other steps. Reza was mentioning, for example, just having access to legal identity, or many other preventing circumstances that happen in society, so that help in this sphere. So then, number two, I think just that we need to understand that justice is multidimensional. I think a challenge that we currently have just in trying to make the business case is just trying to understand all the different aspects that having access to justice mean. So, and understanding that many people can go through many different journeys and end up just with a bad outcome, or not necessarily having outcomes because they got stuck at different circumstances in the middle. Some people may not necessarily know what to do. Some other people may just face a lengthy process. Some other people may have a terrible outcome. So then understanding all those aspects and then trying to look at ways of quantifying them so that we can talk about met and unmet legal needs and eventually design policy around that, that's an important area that we need to develop in the future. So obviously linked to this is the idea of data. I think data and evidence. I think just right now we are just starting this process, moving into the direction of having more data. But if we compare where the justice field is to other fields, the health field, for example, just imagine the amount of data, information that health practitioners have in order to make decisions, not necessarily on how to run a hospital, but in general about what kind of interventions are more useful to prevent epidemics and so on. Just that's the kind of thinking that we should have. And in order to do that, we need more data, we need more evidence, just that can support those type of interventions. Understanding the mechanisms by which this happens. We want to make the case of justice for development. So why it happens? So just what are the mechanisms by which justice impact development? Importantly, just obviously measure the impact just of the different interventions. And I mentioned impact. I think the literature today talks about outputs, just outcomes in some cases, but we really want to know how it impacts people's lives. Economists actually just have this idea of impact, so how is affecting your economic well-being, your health in the next 5 years, if you didn't have access or had access to a particular mechanism, right? Then, obviously, in order to make the case, just the first step is the impact, but we need to know the costs as well. So we need to talk about return. And other areas in general have made enormous progress in this to actually try to quantify the return of investing one particular dollar into these interventions versus in other. At the end of the day, we know that resources are limited, and we need to make the case that justice is important, but health is also important, and education is important. So how those decisions have to be made is something that we need to make progress. And obviously, this is just simply the final point. This is a study, just a cross-country study that tried to standardize or build on a standardized information, but individual case studies, individual country studies, experiences of countries, of what countries have done, just on many different types of interventions is very important actually just for making the case. Reza talked about just the few examples that exist in the US. It's necessary just that we broaden the field to include examples from other countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Alejandro. And yes, now I'd like to invite Trevor, please.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask that my slides be brought up if that's possible. Thank you very much. So first, congratulate Tatiana, the OECD, Reza on this terrific paper, and thanks for organizing this panel. I'm going to be very quick. I know some people have to jump out to other sessions, and I want to make sure there's space for conversation. I'm going to very quickly talk about two things. Highlight a couple of current projects that I think are examples of the kinds of things that we might want to do. And then secondly, I'm going to give a couple of bullet points on what I think might be some fruitful areas for research. In the conversation that I hope we'll still have time for, people can ask about these various projects. So the first one, a big one, Reza's already summarized. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's the legal needs study that did focus on costs. And I do think individual and knock-on social costs are going to be key for this conversation going forward. A second study that really goes a little bit to Natalie's question. It was a very small study, but I think it might give us an example of something to do more of, which was focusing on particularly family dispute resolution processes, in particular what worked, what didn't in high conflict, low conflict, what they cost, and then an attempt at a social return on investment of the different processes. So we've done that to try and get a sense of what we might do more in that area. A third project, totally different. A community-based project that we are organizing with 3 countries in Africa, and the idea is to focus on sites of community justice, so not courts, not state-run projects, but chosen by local communities, and then to do some of this cost analysis, some of the impact analysis that Alejandro talked about, and then rather than in isolation, our job is to try and scale up and coordinate some of that research. We're not scaling up the projects or the delivery modes. What we're doing is we're trying to scale up the research in venues like this. So that's a different kind of focus with a different kind of project. Another one that really, Micah's my boss on this one. She's running another session right now. But it's going to be a small output, but what we're trying to do is get a sense on what's out there on return on investment studies. Some of the stuff is in various places. The idea is to try and put it in one place so that we at least have a sense of Alejandro's last point. When you spend $1 on one thing, what do you get at the other end? And so to get a bit of a sense of that. This won't add value in terms of new data, but what it will do, I hope, is at least give us a sense of the collection of data on this, and with a bit of social return on investment as well. And then finally, a different kind of study that I'm excited about, something that we just got some money for last week, and the idea is to track clients of community clinics. And it's not going to be a randomized control group. I've obsessed about that. I've kind of failed on that. I'm not going to do it yet. I think those are good studies. This is really just going to be about following clients of clinics for a period of time to essentially try and say something interesting about the value add to their life on getting legal interventions, some notion of substantive justice, and I'm excited about this. So that's an example of a different kind of study that I think might be value that we can quantify. So those are some things that we're actually doing. It's not just a wish list, it's what we're working on that I picked as different types of things that we might want to look at in this area. And then my final slide really is about the question on what do we do next? And I do think that there's lots of work on costs. I think the question that came up early on about, I like what we found on cost, both individual and social, but there's lots more to be done. I think we could say more about that. So that's an area for sure. I think longitudinal studies, which are big in health, we've done very little of that in law. I think we need to do more of that, so that'll be important, and I think we need to think about that. Certainly return on investment, social return on investment. And my final 2 points, what are we measuring? I think we're good at measuring process. We're starting to get okay at measuring outcomes. I think we're good at measuring people's satisfaction. So I think we need to come up with an idea about what is quality of justice. And then finally, I think the justice piece. And I'm really keen on coming up with ways to think about the outcome, not whether someone got a resolution or whether they got whatever, but getting some sense of whether that's a good thing in society and thinking that through. And I don't think we're there yet, but that will be value for money in terms of a business case that I think ultimately what people care about are safe streets, safe homes, happy lives, the good life. And I think we will be successful when we start to measure people's arrival at the good life. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Trevor. And I'd like to go back to Reza on this. Thank you.
I'm not going to take the floor again for 45 minutes, but just a couple of remarks. I mean, obviously, as we started saying, I mean, we need a lot more impact assessments on new ways of intervention and broader ways of intervention. And there are things such as randomized controlled trials would go a long way in establishing a basis of evidence that this is what works. Second observation is that social science in general, economics, and in particular in this field has traditionally been divided between two approaches of assessment. One being focusing on impact. How can we establish causality in impact? And another looking at costs and benefits. And looking at costs and benefits without having a proper notion of what is the actual impact and what is something that we suspect might be the impact. So it's much less rigorous. There is probably now in some areas of empirical studies on justice ways to reconcile these two things and bring in findings from rigorous impact assessments into assessments of costs and benefits. Third observation is on legal needs surveys and things such as longitudinal studies and or focus on particular groups of population that concentrate a lot of not only the legal problems, but the long-term costs. So if we want to understand this, we need longitudinal studies and we need studies that enable focusing on these groups of population. This is typically, with all due respect to the work of the World Justice Project, this is something you cannot do at an international level. You need national legal needs surveys with much more than 1,000 person samples that enable you to zoom in on particular groups of population, and ideally to have panels where these people are followed every couple of years and where you can see how interventions produce or not some lasting results. So these are just 3 areas in which we could do a lot more.
Thank you, Reza, and I actually would like to quickly build on this point that, of course, we invite all of the countries around the table, both OECD members and partners, to really seriously consider investing in legal needs surveys, both to help you in the first place to make the case for investing in justice, but then also to really ensure that you deliver the services that meets the needs of your people, so that they're appropriately targeted, that they're timely, that they emphasize prevention. So there is an important dimension of that. And to remind you all about the guidance that was just recently launched that can support you in this journey. So with this, I know that there have been quite a few links between the discussion on the next steps for measuring costs of lack of access to justice, and actually then how do we think about quantifying the impacts of specific justice interventions. But before I go to the next panel, I feel like we already started the discussion on that. I'd like to see if, yes, there are any maybe additional ideas or questions on what is out there, first of all, from your experiences, from your perspectives, that could be useful to help us strengthen the rigor of quantifying the costs of lack of access, and something that you think that we should be considering in taking this work forward. So that's more of an open conversation and invitation.
First of all, thank you very much for the interventions. In representation of the European Commission, we welcome this study, and we are very happy that we were invited to be here. And it's really good to see that two international organizations are going in the same direction. And it's good that this is highlighted, the severe consequences of unmet legal needs, because it's something that the European Commission has been putting forward for a long time, and that we have been stressing in our discussions also with member states. And it's good that we are going in the same direction, and that we can build up in our experience. And Secretary of State is here, and she can say that it's true that we are always highlighting this. And moreover, it's good to hear also that the need to strive for effective justice and build up on the strength of the institutions. And it was very good to hear you mention the rule of law. And I just wanted, and I also welcome the efforts of the World Justice Project on the studies that you have been, because for the European Commission, these are all parts of the same issue, and it's really good to hear this. And moreover, it was very good to hear the projects that Trevor mentioned, because I take also the floor to profit this opportunity to say that we in the European Commission are open not only to the studies of the OECD, but also to academia, also to the civil society, everything that can help us build up. Of course, our territorial scope is much more limited, but we welcome all the ideas that can help us improve our work that we have been developing. So it's not so much of a question, but a comment, and thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Natalie.
Sorry, again, just two things. So in the UK, unfortunately, the funding for our legal needs survey was not renewed. And so the foundation and other foundations like us have been looking to what could we do in the absence of this. One of the projects that's being pursued, and I wondered if this was being carried out in other jurisdictions, is this idea of linking administrative data sets. Our own Ministry of Justice has done some really innovative work linking data from the Department of Education, from the Department of Work and Pensions, and the Justice data to try and look at outcomes for children from private family law disputes. The Nuffield Foundation has also used one of our secure data labs, which allows linking data at the individual level, to link data from CAFCAS, which is our sort of court advisory service in family law, to look at the downstream consequences of judgments in the family sphere. And I wondered if anyone on the panel had any experience of linking administrative data, and what the benefits and drawbacks of that might be from your perspective in terms of quantifying the impact of engagement with legal services.
Yeah, there is something in the UK and also Australia that we actually document in the report that was launched yesterday. Yes, since we have a UK representative, yes, maybe Chris.
Well, I just had another question actually to build on what Natalie said, just to complicate things. So my point really was, you know, there's also something about kind of, I think, whose responsibility it is to collect this evidence and do this work. You know, it seems to be still incumbent on justice departments to understand legal need and do research in that space. And, you know, you look around this conference, who's here from a health department or an education department or a home department? You know, we're all mainly in the justice sphere. So I wonder, is there something, and in England and Wales, I'm not sure how much, if I went to the Department for Education and said, what do you know about legal needs surveys and what it says about how people resolve legal problems that have an education dimension, I doubt they'd be able to give me an answer. I doubt they'd know much about it. So, you know, I wonder if there's more of a case for kind of centralizing this kind of stuff perhaps to a statistical department that does general population surveys and has an overarching remit for social justice and is able to kind of promulgate the message a little bit more generally rather than it being a little bit niche, or some way to kind of share the responsibility between different departments that have an interest. Because, you know, also it's interesting if you go to somewhere like Citizens Advice or a frontier kind of advice provider, they do know this stuff, you know. They understand it very well because they're directly affected and they see the impacts. But it's actually that middle gap between other areas of social policy in the Justice Department where there seems to be this kind of lack of knowledge and understanding about legal needs and the link between unmet legal needs and the social consequences that go with it. So it's sort of partly a comment and partly kind of interested to see if other people have, in the absence of legal needs surveys, what are other departments doing apart from justice departments on these issues?
I'll be very quick because I don't think it answers either the question or the comment, but I think it's really critical and there's so many missing steps. One is the administrative data that is not kept. Secondly, the collaborative administrative discussion that is not being had. And then third, the connection between those gaps and the front lines and those of us who are researching it. So I think we have a grand failure of several levels. One perhaps positive step, though, that we've been trying to do in our country is collaborative tables. And I know that we're not the only one, but we've certainly had some success at bringing different parts of the justice system together and now starting to have different parts of the justice problem come together in the way that you've talked about education and health and what have you. So it's really early days, but I do think once we get the sort of the identification, whereas we have that it's a problem, not a legal problem, and then we get those justice tables together, and I think it's not the sort of a grand table like this, but it's really on the ground, people in the trenches, then we can start to measure fairly quickly, I think, and connect that data link. But I don't think we're there because I'm not sure we've got the high-level leadership in the way that you've just talked about.
Yes, on the first point, this is an area that still requires a lot of research. Just until very recently, just very few countries actually had legal needs surveys. And I have not seen just studies that actually link administrative data with legal needs surveys to validate one or the other. The two are different. So the two are in principle telling us different things. And they should be used in tandem for designing policy. But to your question is, okay, so can we use one as a substitute of the other one, at least for a few things? So, and I haven't seen yet, so for which things this could be used. I mean, the administrative data, there are a lot of different indicators and so on. And it is certainly something that should be done, because doing legal needs surveys is actually expensive. It's something that you cannot be doing constantly just to track the performance. So then it should be done at a certain time, and then just find some other mechanisms to track your progress over time. To the second comment, I completely agree. I think that there are some countries that are moving just in the direction of introducing the legal needs surveys as part of the the national surveys done by the National Statistical Agency. Just I think Isabel is here, right? So, yeah. So just with the intention of actually introducing the idea in the national planning, so that different agencies and usually the executives serve as a coordinator for the different agencies to use this. And I think, I mean, that should be to a certain extent part of the goal of the discussion here, is to just take the idea that justice is not simply justice in the Justice Department, but it applies to many different things.
In response to your comment, Chris, if I heard a part of it correctly, you were lamenting the idea that the onus would be on the Ministry of Justice or some other government agency to engage in the type of activity that would be required to link justice outcomes to those that are more directly welfare related, health, education, employment. And I would argue, as one of the academics represented in the room, the onus is on us to do that work, but with the cooperation of the government agencies. One of the biggest problems that my colleagues and I run into is the availability of a wealth of information from individual government agencies that never can speak to each other. Even within the criminal sector, you will have court databases and jail databases that have no overlap at all. And if government agencies could, instead of trying to focus attention right now on necessarily creating the findings, leave that to the researchers who have a lot more time, create the ability, the infrastructure to make those linkages in the research. And there's an example that I'm happy to talk about more offline of one state in the US that built, essentially to protect privacy-related issues, a black box to just about everybody except a core group of government-appointed officials where those linkages could be made, and de-identified data popped out on the other side. So there are a lot of creative solutions, but I don't want ministries to think that the burden is on them to make it happen.
Again, I'd like to refer everyone to the publication that was launched yesterday, and the discussion on the ways to measure legal needs and the justice gap at the national level. And in fact, one of the key findings and key policy, I would say, recommendations is to use legal needs surveys as kind of to map the type of the need, the level of the needs, who experiences this need at the high level, but then also to use and complement these findings by the administrative data that can help also locate where the needs is at the local levels, at the regional, so on and so forth. And actually there are a couple of examples, namely from the Law and Justice Foundations of New South Wales, Australia, where they actually were able to match both the findings from the legal needs surveys and administrative data to actually target those needs much more precisely. So, and this is actually one of the future streams of work of this roundtable, is to explore this nexus between the survey data and administrative data. And I'd like to respond also to Chris on the point that yes, we often get the impression that legal needs surveys or kind of more general attention to legal problems is the responsibility of the Ministry of Justice. But I think that as part of also the OECD work on this topic, we emphasize the role of the centers of government, the role of the kind of whole of government approach to really show that actually unaddressed legal needs have an impact on other sectoral outcomes. And it's really how do you raise awareness and draw attention of policymakers in those other areas to the importance of this issue. So, and with this, I think that the timing is getting quite tight. I'd like to move to the next mini panel that will consider the next steps in ways to measure the benefits of different access to justice interventions. And more specifically, we would like to discuss as part of this panel the trade-offs, the priorities, and potential synergies in measuring the benefits. Then the question is, can some of the lessons of individual and country-level interventions be shared internationally? So what are the challenges and opportunities for that? And then what could be the next steps for deepening the case for investment? And I'd like to, introduce the panelists. It's Chris Griffin, who is visiting professor, research scholar, University of Arizona, and Rebecca Sandefer, associate professor of sociology and law from the University of Illinois. So, Chris, you have 5 minutes.
As others have done, I would like to begin by thanking Reza for this incredible work. I remember seeing the version of it in Riga last year, and the progress that's been made is truly outstanding, and you should be very proud of the product that you have. And I believe that it has done made tremendous strides in making the business case for access to justice. And the question, one of them that Tatiana has teed up, is what do we do then after we have established that there are economic reasons to pursue innovation in the formal and informal legal sectors? What can we do in terms of thinking about how to deploy those innovations and then measure their impact? I'd like to try to be as specific as possible in the short amount of time that I have in thinking about 2 issues. And one, I'm really, really glad that preceding speakers talked so much about the differential use of administrative data and survey data. And I do believe that the survey data are indispensable for establishing the existence of the legal needs. But when it comes to the measurement and evaluation of innovations, I like to think that ex ante, you cannot choose between administrative or survey. That the dictates of the question you're asking, the subject matter of the legal question, and then the availability of relative data sources are what matters. My specific example is eviction cases. We know in the US that eviction is a plague. So many people are displaced from their homes, and we worry about what it means for someone to go to court and have a summary proceeding dispossess them of their apartment. That's fine and well as a matter of pure law. But we also know that there are health, employment, education, family law consequences to that displacement. So for a study that my colleagues at the Access to Justice Lab at Harvard Law School and I are developing is to make it explicit that we don't care just about who gets possession of the unit, the landlord or the tenant, but what happens to that displaced tenant. And we know an even further concrete example. Take the issue of homelessness. There is wonderful administrative data on homelessness in each of the 50 states overseen by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. What's the problem with those administrative data? So many of the people who are displaced are single mothers with children. Single mothers with children tend to hide in the shadows for fear of assault and being attacked. They don't go to shelters. They don't feel safe there. And if you only use the administrative data to track the homelessness that results from eviction, you will severely undercount this important part of the population. Therefore, in this study, we propose to marry the administrative data that we can get with survey responses that are directly administered to subjects in the study. And so there is a creative way to mix the two and not rely on one over the other because they have their comparative advantages. So in general, I'd like to make the point that when we consider how we evaluate new ideas that build upon the case already made for access to justice, that we think broadly and laterally about the use of these 2 sources. And second, I was asked to discuss something a bit broader than the types of innovations we usually discuss at these roundtables. A lot of the new ideas tend to be very micro level. A new piece of software deployed at a court, a new way of processing cases at a jurisdiction. What happens, though, when an entire ministry or other government entity decides to innovate? How do you evaluate there? Most of you know that my colleagues and I are diehard supporters of the randomized control trial. We tend to speak of it as if it is the only religion that matters in this space. I will relent on this question, on this issue of more national, more macro level innovations. You cannot randomize at that level. But there are quasi-experimental methods, natural experiments, where if you treat the innovation as something that will be subject to evaluation and pilot it in subunits of the entire country, then you can create that natural experiment. You can compare areas in which the innovation is deployed against those where it is not, and in that way get fairly robust, rigorous evidence as to whether the innovation works. So just as I would never want to vouch for either administrative or survey data alone, I would not do that with methodologies, and I believe that the best case for proving an innovation works is to be as flexible as possible, again, depending on the subject matter of the legal question and depending on the available resources in the jurisdiction in which this is being tested. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and Becky.
So I want to join everyone in congratulating the OECD on its leadership in bringing us to this point, and on Reza for writing such a stimulating paper, and also on the World Justice Project and Alejandro for producing data that allows these discoveries to happen. These are all really great accomplishments. So I want to make 4 really quick points. The first is that we often talk about as though there is the business case, but actually there are many business cases, so different constituencies have different value propositions. And if you want to tell a story to them about why they should care or get on board with you, you need to think about what their value propositions are. I'll give you a crazy example from the US. I was studying a non-lawyer service provider that went into a court, and it did stuff lawyers used to do. And so one of the questions is, will the people whose work is being disrupted by this accept it? Will the funders accept it? And so I said, okay, what would make you want to support this program? And there was one group of essential stakeholders who said, we will only support this program if you can show us that non-lawyers change legal outcomes. We want to see that the outcomes of these cases are different. Otherwise, we should be spending this money on lawyers. And then I went to another totally essential stakeholder. If they're not on board, this will not happen. And I said, what would make you support this intervention? And they said, we will only support this intervention if you can prove to us it has no impact on the legal outcomes of the cases. Because if it does, it's the unauthorized practice of law. And we don't want to support that as neutral actors in this space. So this is going to happen all over when you do these interventions. And so thinking about what the different value propositions are is key to making the business case. I would like to suggest that we often talk about access to justice as though it's principally about providing services that people don't pay for. I think we also, though, heard about the sandwich groups, and Reza's nice paper shows that there are countries where if you're rich or you're poor, you have more access to justice than if you're in the middle. The group that's going to serve that middle is the private bar. When those people need services from lawyers, there's a business case to be made to the private bar about how it should be delivering services differently than it does. Maybe that's one of the constituencies we could be talking to. The third point I want to make is, Reza's absolutely right. So I was looking at his awesome graphs, and I was thinking there's an army of PhD students in political science and sociology who are going to try to write dissertations that explain why that bar is really big in Colombia and really small in Taiwan, right? And those are, in some ways, those are going to be crap. But in some ways, they're not, because there are scope conditions that let us learn from what's going on in one place and apply it to another. The example that always comes to my mind is I learn a lot from the Law and Justice Foundation of New South Wales' stuff, which is in Australia. But you know what? There are big chunks of my country that are just like Australia. It's a big bunch of space with not very many people and indigenous populations that have been oppressed for hundreds of years, right? So there's actually a lot to learn. So thinking about what the frameworks would be that would tell us what is Australia generalized to, what is Colombia generalized to, I think that's a next intellectual step here. And then the last point I want to make is, and this comes out of a conversation I had with Natalie and Liberty before lunch. There's a number we bat around in the United States, which is that domestic violence costs $1 billion a year. I don't know how much domestic violence costs. I have no idea. The point of that number, which is probably wrong, is that it's really expensive. It's a really significant thing. And so the kind of business case you need to make depends a lot on the kind of audience that you're talking to. So if you're the if you're the England and Wales Ministry of Justice and everything is pretty centralized, you need to make a technocratic business case. You need to have an Excel spreadsheet that shows money over here, moves over here, something like that. So that's one kind of business case you might make. But if what you're trying to do is engage the imagination of the public, or of legislators, or of civil society organizations, a much looser business case that sort of comes up with a number that sounds plausible can really engage the imagination of those folks. And it's still a business case, but it doesn't require that Excel spreadsheet that a technocracy does. So I think this is we're at a wonderful point, and there's a lot of potential here, and I'm actually, as I'm not usually, very hopeful.
Excellent, thank you. And of course, one of the challenges, as was mentioned also by Reza in his presentations, is to see how can we maximize the research and the evidence also from low-income countries, from medium-income countries, from from a much wider variety of regions, because of course most of the evidence that we've included, we were able to include in the paper. It comes from I would say North American continent. So the question is, how can we engage a much wider community in actually investing in rigorous and solid ways to understand impacts and costs and benefits of different interventions. And of course, we also welcome your reflections and your insights on this question. And then also, we've outlined in the paper the main types of interventions that we were able to find the evidence on, because again, this is a bottom-up approach. We've looked at what is out there, what is available, including both in the academic, in the Braille literature, but then also in the policy documents of the countries with which we are working. But then can we extend this analysis to other types of intervention? If yes, what maybe needs to happen to get it done? So we would welcome the reflections of the audience and then also of the panelists on these questions.
Just one very quick comment, picking up on what Rebecca just said, because I just think what you just said is really important, and it was lost on me until recently. Reza mentioned a statistic that we found in our Canadian study, that for Canadians that have report having at least one legal problem, they report spending on average $6,000 to resolve that legal problem. We got that number, and I thought it was interesting, and then I realized I have no idea what that means, whether that's high, whether that's low, what have you. So the very rough thing we did is then I went and looked at, so what is the average that Canadians spend on food every year and on housing every year? And on average, Canadians spend $7,000 on food and about $14,000 on shelter. So then that number started to become alive to me, and it was only then that people started to actually use that number. So I think your point is really important. That was a really crappy little number crunch I did, but it actually brought it alive in a way that it didn't make any sense to me before.
I just wanted to ask, so one of the things that hasn't been covered but that we've been quite interested in is a lot of legal need is generated by policies that are constructed in a way that creates legal need. And a good example of this at the moment is we as a foundation have had to invest with other foundations a lot of money in supporting the advice sector to deal with uptake in requests from EU nationals who want to understand what their legal position is going to be post-Brexit. And it's taken away. The sector of immigration advice is already extremely fragile in the UK, and it's been completely overstretched by this. So I wondered, are there any lessons from how can we use data on legal need to compel policymakers to make better policy or to be more aware of the sort of likely downstream consequences of the policy that they actually make. I notice a lot of the stuff a lot of the burden is placed on Ministry of Justice departments who are tasked with mopping up the mess that's often made upstream. So how can we, are there ways that we can mainstream that? I guess that's my question to the panel.
My response to that is probably too ambitious and probably too optimistic. If I can join Rebecca in being very optimistic relative to my default baseline. The idea would be that for major policy proposals that are subject of legislation that have pretty well predictive impacts on health and welfare, that you don't do it until you have an evidence base. Or you require that as a part of the legislative action that there be an evaluation of that new idea. Otherwise, you will have to approach everything in a backward-looking fashion, and you will run the risk of having the new policy implemented and not being able to undo the adverse effects of that policy until an innovation is discovered, it's self-tested, and then deployed. So again, my very ambitious, optimistic take is that you ensure and you require that new legislative action be accompanied by an evaluation of that policy.
Yeah, in complement, maybe I can say a word about the overall standpoint of policy evaluation as, for instance, is practiced by the OECD, which is in a way a middle ground between like a hard approach to evidence-based policymaking, as Chris, for instance, referred to it, that you need hard evidence, natural experiments, or something that comes as close as possible to a rigorous assessment of impact. And the reality, which is that policies are oftentimes undertaken by people, in the good cases, people who have a vision, which is a very deterministic vision, which has been fed by some sort of evidence, but it's not really clear what. But that is in a way in a tunnel where we think I'm going to do this, and this is going to be the impact, right? This falls really short of a kind of overall understanding of what is the theory of change that you have in mind. What are the various factors that can come in the way of the change that you're trying to produce, and how you are going to monitor and evaluate this whole thing to understand this is the impact that I have good chances of having generated, but possibly these are the reasons why this impact did not take place. And oftentimes it's a little change. If you are able to monitor that, you can make that little change that is going to bring you a lot more results. So this is really what the way in which we're trying to evaluate is to tell policymakers, you need to have a fairly clear idea of these are the inputs and the outputs that I have in mind, but to take me to the eventual impact that I'm trying to have, there's various channels, and these channels can be obstructed by different factors. To have a clear idea of this in mind and a clear apparatus to monitor the effects and to evaluate, and then probably, I mean, we have the possibility of producing a reasonable basis of evidence on policy.
Maybe just a quick reaction on my side, that while legal needs surveys are not explicitly designed to actually help improve policy making per se, they can nonetheless provide some indications. They can at least start asking the questions that if your people are facing many legal problems in the area of land disputes, so is there maybe a systemic response that is needed to deal with some of them, as opposed to addressing them on an individual basis through the individual appeals? So I think that at least these surveys and the results can help policymakers to start reflecting on what is the basis and why, yes, there are, you know, the problems that are people facing in this policy area or in another one, because we do know that the types of legal problems vary from area to area, from country to country, from region to region. So, and it can also stimulate the questioning. So, is there something that needs to be done on a systematic basis? So this brings us to the next round, our last mini panel, which will be looking at the next steps in building the indicators on access to justice. And of course, here the challenge is to start reflecting what types of indicators could be helpful to reflect, to measure and to monitor progress in meeting legal needs. So is it also a combination of different data sources that need to be put in place to enable ministries of justice, centers of government, but then also the global community to understand what progress in meeting legal needs is being made or can be made. So here the key questions that we'd like to see addressed as part of this panel is, first of all, what are the efforts, what are the current efforts both at the global level and the national level in developing these indicators? And this discussion builds on a number of different discussions that have been taking place as part of the previous roundtables as well, and we would like to see what also has been the progression in this area. Second, what tools and data sources exist and can be used to support the development of these indicators, and then also what are the challenges and opportunities in this regard. So is there something that we can collectively do to move this forward? So I'd like to first invite a national perspective, Diana Urbano, who is the Director for Justice, Defense and Governance at the Department of National Planning of Colombia. And then we'll move to talk about the global indicators process. And here we'll have Aparna Basniat, who is representative of UNDP and the rule of law and human rights specialist. And then we go back to the national perspective, that of the statistical agency, Isabel Schmid, who comes from South Africa Statistical Agency. So we'll start with Diana.
Thank you, Tatiana. First, I want to thank you for the document because it's so enlightening for us, because it's focused on a problem that we don't have near close kind of evidence to resolve the problems about what is the cost of the lack of access to justice. So Colombia has a first intent. We have our national access to justice survey. That is a good example because the scope of the survey is national and local. And also we have our index of access to justice. And this is the first point that I want to highlight. Surveys is not enough source of information. Probably we need to reinforce the information with another kind of data. Alejandro says that administrative records, probably judicial records of the system, penitentiary records. So we need to have an overview and bigger picture of what is happening with the access of the justice in our countries. Secondly, probably our sources have some problems. The lack of rigorosity in the consecution of the information could be a problem, so we need to be very careful with the information that we are working with our measures. As the paper mentioned, this is there is a need to do more investigation about what is happening with the cost of the justice. And I totally agree with Alejandro with the points that he puts on the table, because we need to know what is the return of the invest. Because I work with the Colombian government, and for the government it's important to know what is happening with the money, who is investing in the public policy. This could be a minor issue, but sometimes we need to design better policies and implement the policies in an effective way with few money. So if we know the cost of the implementation of the policies and the cost what is happening with the lack of justice, we can do comparison and take better decisions and do more better focalizations of the policies. What comes next? What happened for us in the next years? The next year we are doing again our survey, and we are doing a review of the questions that we are formulating. Probably for us, one of the lessons learned here in this panel is it would be important to introduce a new question about what is happening with the cost of the lack of access in Colombia. And this probably produce a case study about what is the business case that we can improve or we can promote in Colombia. So this document is so important for us because allows us to make better questions for our country.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to again congratulate Colombia for yes, such a comprehensive approach to your legal needs surveys, but also to your willingness and interest to continuously improve it by learning from other experiences. So thank you for that. And I'd like to turn to our partner now to talk about the global processes and opportunities.
Thank you, Tatiana. First, I'd like to thank the government of Portugal and OECD for hosting this meeting. It's been a really good discussion yesterday and today. Also to congratulate you on a really excellent paper. I think it was I went through it last night and it was really a very useful paper also from a global perspective. I just will reflect just overall a little bit on the paper and then go into a little bit more in terms of the statistical next steps in terms of the broader SDG process. So my reflections are mainly from UNDP's perspective, which is a more global perspective, and looking particularly from the perspective of low income and conflict-affected and crisis-affected contexts. So let me start by saying that this discussion is particularly relevant given the call for all countries to report on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the target on access to justice for all. As this paper indicates, access to justice for all is not only has an intrinsic value, but is also critical for creating the enabling environment and supporting people to realize their rights and facilitate the achievement across all the SDGs, including addressing poverty eradication, gender equality, decent work, reducing inequalities, and of course, Goal 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. So I think the focus of the paper around civil justice in particular, I think is very useful because it touches across all these areas and makes a stronger case overall on why you need to look at civil justice as well when measuring access to justice for the SDGs. So from our perspective, the paper is a very important contribution on the evidence base on the centrality of access to justice for the realization of rights and for achieving sustainable development. It is significant, as was mentioned earlier, I think, because it helps to make the case to ministries of finance and planning of the costs of lack of access to justice and can encourage prioritization of addressing access to justice as part of national development plans and budget decisions. As we see in terms of the SDG processes, there is an increasingly whole-of-government approach and also in terms of planning and sort of prioritization in terms of budgets as well. And by making the case to look at civil justice as well as part of these processes will be very important. The findings from the paper reaffirm UNDP's approach to access to justice, which emphasizes that the starting point of justice should be people and their experience in seeking and obtaining justice remedies. In most countries that we work in, we try to understand what barriers people face in seeking out justice, whether it's from a civil, criminal, or related to administrative matters, and support them in overcoming these obstacles. This includes, and we take on a human rights-based approach to access to justice, supporting both rights holders to empower them to know and demand their rights and entitlements, as well as duty bearers to meet the demand. So for example, in Bangladesh, we support community mediation, dispute resolution at the local level, looking particularly at what we're calling village courts, which are actually local government authorities in terms of the key role that they play in dispute resolution. In Iraq and Somalia, I think it was mentioned in the paper as well, we are supporting mobile courts and legal aid services. In Myanmar, we're looking particularly around housing, land, and property rights, and what sort of support related to legal awareness and legal advice on housing, land, and property rights, which is quite a challenge. So the other point I wanted to reflect a little bit on is some of the ideas or the areas that you mentioned for additional research, and it would be good to consider further how you'd want to invest in this in the future. So for example, in response to the call of the 2030 agenda to leave no one behind, it's important and to also look at making sure no countries are left behind either. And so I think if you're looking at low income and fragile and conflict-affected contexts, they're often, and we saw that with the MDGs, they were often the ones that didn't achieve the MDGs and are also the ones that are most at risk of not achieving the SDGs, including around access to justice. So I think additional investment is needed to further examine the particular and intersecting disadvantages faced by different population groups in such contexts, in accessing justice, including for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, for example, or victims of large-scale human rights violations, as well as for IDP and refugee populations, among others. Another challenge highlighted by the paper, and that may require further analysis, and I think it's already been mentioned by Reza and I think Alejandro as well, is in terms of the overall rule of law environment that may be a barrier in preventing certain groups from accessing justice. So for example, legal frameworks that inherently exclude certain population groups, or situations such as where the independence of the judiciary is being eroded and protection of rights of different population groups are being infringed upon. In responding to the demand for access to justice, the overall normative framework, as well as the robustness of institutions, is critically important, especially in countries where democratic space is shrinking and in contexts recovering from conflict and crisis where rule of law institutions may be weak. So I'll finally come to sort of some next steps and opportunities that may be useful to be aware about to build on the work that's been done, both from this paper as well as the OECD OSJI Legal Needs Survey Handbook. So in 2020, the UN Statistical Commission will review proposals for additional indicators for the broader SDG framework. This provides a significant opportunity to enhance the SDG monitoring framework overall and propose a more holistic indicator for SDG 16.3, which is on access to justice, to complement the existing indicators which are primarily related to criminal justice issues. So in the coming months, what's called the Interagency Expert Group on SDGs will be making recommendations to the UN Statistical Commission on possible indicators to propose. So it'd be really useful opportunity now to draw on what's already been done and sort of the evidence base that's been developed to propose a civil justice indicator or a broader access to justice, a more holistic access to justice indicator as part of this framework. I think as has been mentioned, often if countries now have a responsibility for reporting, particularly globally, on an indicator, they also take on the responsibility to also look at how to prioritize these issues at the national level as well. But I would also say that this requires a significant and long-term commitment and investment in terms of developing the methodology, investing in the data collection, and building capacities, particularly of national statistics offices, to collect this data. So just finally, just to give an example, this week we've just proposed, UNDP's proposed a methodology on measuring representation in the judiciary. So we've been working to look at how, at all levels of court, developing methodology and looking at all levels of courts and trying to disaggregate by age, sex, disability, and population groups. And this has just been approved by the Interagency Expert Group on SDGs. It was already an indicator. We've developed a methodology, and now we're going to be looking to have globally all national statistics offices report on this data. And so increasingly, the countries also will have to look at, this will also eventually impact policy making, because you begin to look at what a proportion of your population is actually being represented in your judiciaries. So,
So thank you, Aparna, for providing really useful suggestions for the next steps for the paper, but then also for highlighting the opportunity that will be presented at the global level for potentially really taking the monitoring framework for the SDG agenda, but in particular when it comes to access to justice, and potentially also integrating the elements related to access to civil justice. So, and this is a potential opportunity for this community to see how this can happen. Now I'd like to invite Isabel Schmidt to share with us a perspective from the National Statistics Agency and the work that you've been doing on indicators and access to justice.
Okay. Can I please have the presentation? Is there still somebody in the control room? Maybe I should start by saying, you know, there are some advantages to being the last speaker, and there's also some disadvantages. Clear disadvantages, most of you are probably by now quite tired of listening. Advantages, I could have listened to most of the questions and the queries, and I can work some of that into my presentation. So Chris, some of your questions will be answered during my presentation. The reason why I'm here is not because I'm an expert. South Africa has just recently conducted their first legal needs survey, or a survey with a legal needs module. In fact, the end of this week, tomorrow, our data collection comes to an end. So what I would like to share with you more is the governance and the accountability process that we follow, and what we are going to do now with this information that we've just collected. And I must confess, I often feel a bit like a bull in a china shop when I'm in this meeting, because I'm not a legal expert or involved in your field. And so my point of entry is often so random that some people look at this and say, wow, okay. But anyway, I'll try and adjust to what I think your expectations are. So the data that we've just collected in legal needs feeds into our strategic management process in government. And basically, when we look at the whole cycle, we do a review and analysis, formulation, planning. I think many governments do that. But when you look at the top one, which is the strategic monitoring and evaluation, that's where we begin to look at indicators, and we begin to look at the kind of statistics that we produce and how that can actually feed into this process. So what I want to point out here, and I'll be very brief because I know we are running over time, is that as of the end of March, we've actually ended our previous 5-year planning cycle in government. So in May, there will be an election and there will be a new government in place. In June, all government departments will have to start planning for the next 5 years. Now, this is significant because unlike most of the time, our survey data will be ready on time to feed into a 5-year plan of government. And it's to some extent not really by design. We just ended up being fortunate that it worked out the way it did. But this is the kind of thing that all of you and that we look at, where do we come from, where are we now, and where would we like to go to. But this is where I want to spend a few minutes or a few seconds. We've just heard about the SDG agenda, the plans for including additional indicators, etc. Most government departments in South Africa and the National Statistical Office are absolutely snowed under data requirements, indicators. It's a landscape in chaos. And we get enormous amounts of complaints from all government departments, from our own statistical office, and say we spend so much time running around reporting, we can't do other work. And so our response to this has been to create what we call an integrated indicator framework. And what we basically do is clearly we take our own national development plan, our own medium strategic framework, as the center of our indicator framework. But then we link it back to the other agendas, Agenda 2063, that's the Africa Agenda for Development. SDGs appears there as well. And what we try to do now that we are in the beginning of a new cycle, the SDGs were actually adopted in the middle of our previous cycle. In this new cycle, we'll try to take the indicators in the SDG framework, and we'll try, and when we develop indicators for our medium-term strategic framework, align it all so that there are not some indicators that are slightly similar but actually require different sources or different ways of calculating and computing it. Okay, so I think this is where Chris's question comes in. How do we organize our reporting systems, and how does that relate to access to justice? The Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, I know that there's a National Planning Office here as well, is at the center of our planning efforts in this cycle that we are now going to start. And what we do is every cluster has what they call an outcome that they are responsible for. And so we are now talking about the criminal justice, whatever it's called somewhere else, which includes legal aid, it includes the Department of Justice, Constitutional Development, etc., will come together, and each of them will have their own plan for the 5 years. But then there's an additional step, which is there will be an outcome that will be deliberated upon by all these government departments who has a stake in whatever we have on the table for that outcome. Now, currently, we have an outcome 3, which is called All South Africans will feel and will be and feel safe. So there's obviously a very heavy emphasis on criminal justice. I doubt whether we can change our outcome for the next 5 years to something that relates to civil justice, because criminal justice is currently a heavy issue in South Africa. What we can aim for with the data that we are now going to get out of our legal needs survey would be perhaps to influence what will be the sub-targets of this outcome, and look at how some of our social development outcomes and our education outcomes, etc., can feed into this concept of access to justice and the realization of socioeconomic rights. So the kinds of problems that we've had when we've done this 5-year planning in the past is it's easy for departments to identify which programs they are going to run. So in the case of access to justice, we have Vidu there from the Legal Aid South Africa department. She will sit and say, okay, based on our administrative data systems, these are the interventions we are planning, and this is how we are going to do it, and these are going to be the indicators. But quite often, especially when you go to the impact and the output level, you don't have a source of data. And what do? You can't fabricate an indicator without data that goes into it. You won't have a baseline value. You don't have anything like that. And so what do? We usually then focus on outputs rather than outcomes and inputs. We say we had so many meetings, we had so many court cases, we did that and the other. We use proxies that are not really ideal in this monitoring process. And of course, what we then do is we also exclude certain targets at a high level because we can't monitor it, we can't measure it. And so those are the dilemmas that we face, and maybe some of you as well. So what I just want to quickly speak into before Tatiana calls me to order is if you take our cycle as it is at the moment, at the beginning of the previous 5-year cycle, we identified as a National Statistical Office that there are statistical information gaps in the area of governance statistics. And we built into our plan the establishment of a governance statistics unit. Part of that process of establishing such a unit is to actually consult with all the stakeholders to find out what are the gaps, where do we need to measure, etc. As so happened, in year 1 of that cycle, Pete Chapman knocked on my door at Statistics South Africa and he said, "Hi, we are involved in the World Justice Project. We would like you to look at this questionnaire. They're soon going to do it in South Africa." And that's where an encounter led to a relationship over time where we've received an enormous amount of assistance from the Open Society Foundation and from this group, actually, to help us include this module on legal needs in our survey. And then I must also point out that I know that someone said they had resource problems and they didn't get money for the survey. South Africa, if you follow the news, is also facing serious financial problems. And we knew that if we have this target in our 5-year plan, no extra money is going to come onto the table. So what we did is, after we've gathered the needs, the potential, etc., of course, Legal Aid South Africa was saying, this should have happened yesterday. Please include this legal needs module. We then said, okay, we are currently doing a victimization survey that's run every year. Can we perhaps modify the survey? Because this survey is already sustainable, it's in our work program, it's funded, so that we can address these additional needs that we have now identified through our stakeholder consultations, and that's exactly what we did. We converted that survey into what we call the Governance, Public Safety and Justice Survey, and the contents, even though every year we measure the incidence of victimization, the modules that comes before that changes every year in a 3-year cycle. And so, as I said, end of this week, we finish collection of a questionnaire that has a legal needs module. And so we will publish at the time when the next planning cycle starts. We hope to then involve all our role players. We've got Vidu there from Legal Aid South Africa, the Department of Justice, Constitutional Development, and we'll use the data that we've collected to inform planning for the next 5-year cycle, to provide us with baseline values for the monitoring of this program in this next 5-year cycle. And then, of course, you know, as you've seen, our cycle took 5 years for us to get a new survey instrument on the table. And for most people, governments, that will be the same. And so, in a sense, what we now have to do as a statistical agency planning for the next 5 years is we've delivered on what we've said we wanted to deliver 5 years ago. But now we already have to see what are the next gaps. And we have to see what is it that we are going to do in this 5-year period to bridge those statistical information gaps or indicator gaps or whatever you would call it. And there I rest my case.
Thank you, Isabel, for sharing both the strategies that can be employed by the national statistical agencies and actually really dealing with the constraints of the system, and also in seeing how do you actually work within the system to do what is right in integrating the civil justice related elements, but then also the challenges that you face in this regard. I think that this panel you know, like highlighted a full range of different perspectives from policy making, but also not only the Department of Justice perspective, but actually the whole of government perspective from the National Planning Department. And actually this goes back to the point that was raised by colleagues from the UK Ministry of Justice, that it's how can we take it to the whole of government level. And I think the Colombian case is an effective example in this regard. But then also looking at it from the perspective of the National Statistical Agency, and where you also are playing an important leadership role in working through your system. And then, of course, for the opportunity that now presents itself at the global level, and that how can we work both with the NSA, statistical agencies, and policy-making departments to see whether this opportunity can be meaningfully seized. We are effectively almost out of time. We have 1 minute left before the session is officially over. I'd like to see if there are any final questions, comments from the floor, and perhaps our panelists would like to say one word of concluding remarks, any highlights, reflections? All right, then on this note, I'd like to thank you all for an extremely constructive dialogue and your feedback on the white paper on beginning to make the business case for investing in access to justice. We feel that the findings are significant, the findings are important, but then also we realize that there are many, many limitations, and we are at the beginning of this process, and we really count on continuing to work with all of you, with our research partners, and of course, yes, I even hesitate to name someone in particular because, of course, all of you contribute quite extensively to this work being a success. But also, I'd like to thank the World Justice Project for generously sharing the data so that we can actually advance the analysis and help make the case. So I encourage all of you, all member and partner countries of the OECD to start investing in deepening research evidence and also thinking about how to consider, well, thinking about legal needs surveys at the national level, as that data can indeed help both to strengthen the business case but also help you deliver better services to your people. So thank you so much, and we'll see you in a few minutes for the closing plenary, and now there is a coffee break. Thank you.
Adeus e uma boa tarde. Obrigada também. Ah bon? Parce que, ben oui. Remember in the group that we were talking about, so about the international framework for product science, and this is a model that TikTok can use, and it gives you examples and stuff. It has been interesting for me, and it's good. I can bring back some ideas from my office as well. So nice to have met you. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, take care. Okay, bye. Have a nice day. Yeah, thanks.
Please take a seat. We are going to start. So welcome back to this plenary session, which is in a way an ambitious goal, despite the fact that it will be short. We have been traveling for long from, you know, the starting point toward a people-centered approach in several years. Today we do have the task to figure out the way ahead. And we have many different insights, ideas, inputs that are coming from the previous discussions, and above all, the building blocks that are coming from the breakout sessions. That's the reason we have here around the table those people that will be shortly summarize the main points that have been highlighted during the breakout sessions. I think that what we need to keep in mind is presumably one word, people, and to have it as a mainstream, a streamlining approach in the policy design, in the assessment, not only in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of trust. And nevertheless, we need to have in our scenario the importance of technology, not only as a catalyzer of organizational changes, but also as a way to change the mindset of people in terms of expectations and methods and languages to speak about justice and law in our societies. Not a small task, but I think that we have around the table so many expertise. We have a plural, context. So I think that the elements are here. What we need to do is to put them together and to commit. So I will ask to intervene in the order. Merkat Broms, affiliated professor at Sciences Po Law School, associate law professor in private law and labor and employment law, Conservatoire National des Arts et des Métiers. Jorge Roberto Ordonez Escobar, from the Ministry of Interior in Mexico, head of the Legal Affairs Unit. Marta Santos Pais, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, United Nations. Geoff Mallorin, Director of the Foundation New South Wales Law and Justice. Suerben Tamfous, Legal Counsel, Presidency of Government in Tunisia. And finally, last but not least, Tatiana Teplova, Head Gender Justice for Inclusiveness, Public Governance Directorate of the OECD. I recommend all to keep it in 4 or 5 minutes, no more. We need absolutely to close this session in time because we will have finally the high representatives of the institutions that will be here with us. So we need to be absolutely on time.
Hello, everyone. So just a small introduction to see what we're talking about when we talk about violence and discrimination. And I think our breakup session was more about violence. So there were innovative ways to try to look at fostering people-centered pathways to justice for disadvantaged communities. We know the problems are judicial cost, complexity, time, group-specific barriers that lead to discrimination and stigma, problems with unequal geographical and linguistic access to legal and justice services, weak coordination of different courts. But it was very clear in our session that there is an increasing visibility of violence Of course, the Me Too movement probably helped. Direct and indirect discrimination, both in the workplace and in family settings, persistent sex and racial biases, segregated workplaces, and people are trapped in low-level jobs, problems of equality in the workplace and in the home that lead to systemic discrimination. So these are the points that came out of the brainstorming. First, our panelists, Lori Wright. So two main points that came out were first, the question of gender-centered justice. So the focus is not only on the person, but specifically on women, how to do this. And second, children's best interests, that is actually also linked in the session to issues of intimate violence and family violence. So the first point, Lori Wright from Canada emphasized the new reforms in Canada with a new definition of family violence, which is more expansive and includes a lot of sorts of conducts, not just criminal. She explained that the court has to take into account different protective orders in dangerous situations. There is also another bill in Canada which concerns specifically interpartner violence, and they need to take into account in considerations of bail previously convicted people, individuals, a need for to take into account, though at the same time, the precarious situations of the people that won't have bail, so the lack of income in the case of indigenous population. Then Ilaria Bottigliero explained that yes, there is a problem of gender-blind justice, and that there are still a lot of countries afflicted by conflict that do not have protective legislation. The judicial system must be more responsive to women through a vision where women have to be at the basis of the change. We have to change the paradigm. Women are not only victims or survivors, they're agents of change. They can inspire and empower against inaction and isolation of other women as allies. We also need a holistic view of justice. It's not just the day in court, but prevention of violence, protection needed for women in countries through work with the shelters and support for legal advisors. There were also a lot of interventions on legal and social protections by the Belgian authorities. So development of whole policies that don't just include courts, but also social networks. The representative of Argentina has developed a specific program to measure compliance to help against domestic violence through specific legal aid and specific training of lawyers. I just want to finish. And the US also explained how it is important to develop advocacy in communities and develop coordinated community responses to violence. Second point is the pathway to justice through the best interest of children. The UN representative explained that we should work also on boys and men in awareness raising about violence, and the narratives of children are important to develop pathways to justice. So just to finish off and just to summarize, the question of discrimination was actually raised through the question of violence, and I think global violence today is an important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, Mr. Escobar, the floor is yours. You have your 4 minutes.
Thank you. I just talk about the strength ideas focus on our table. And we usually think that, or it's commonly said that exclusively the major corporations, either national or multinational, at any latitude can benefit of an expeditious and adequate administration and justice. But such affirmation may mislead us due to the fact that the countries, such as most of ours, may narrow or minimize the gap between the powerful and well-counseled corporations, either at the corporate instance or litigation before turning to the local or federal courts. So that strength ideas was in my table, how justice could support the economy. And we saw that the law usually don't focus on the small. We need to identify barriers and gaps to do better conditions in the access for justice to the micro and medium enterprises. We saw the cases of Portugal and Latvia, and we talk about insolvency procedures that must be focused not only in creation of enterprises, even in the special recovery procedures. If not seen as a remedy, these procedures doesn't work. And we talk about the Portugal case, and we saw that 70% of the territory has specialized courts. We saw that big changes are made, helping companies to simplify fast the procedures to born and to die. We saw that it's very important to an enterprise know when he start, where they born, and when they die, because this give us security and enforcement to the enterprises. We saw about, we talk about one very important idea, the difference between made things as an 18th century organization and do the things now with another focus, especially on organization, technology, and measures. That's the difference between made things as it was the 11th century and the process of the enterprises creation as made as in the cases we saw with organization, technology, and measures that could be the most strong ideas that I have in this table. That was the fourth difference. We talk about the model of Portugal and Latvia and show that efficiency and make clear, confidential, and put one figure that's very interesting, that a business recovery mediator can be things that made changes in this matter. Finally, I want to talk about how judicial access to justice supported the economy. And in this case, in the case of micro and medium enterprises, is a matter that is very important because they made a difference to the economy. That's it in my table.
Thank you very much. Now I ask Marta to report on children and young people breakdown session.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that we had two beautiful presentations about legal aid and information in Israel, and also a very good example of how services come to the child rather than the child being brought before different services. But just to highlight some of the issues that were presented in our discussion. First of all, recognizing that access to justice is a fundamental human right, but at the same time is a critical dimension of how we ensure respect for all human rights of children and young people. And examples were provided of right to health, education, housing, and of course the list could go on. And similarly, that it is at the center of the Sustainable Development Agenda, as we know, and therefore we have a great opportunity to refine the implementation processes that are taking place around the world. And the third overall dimension is, of course, that children and young people are a very meaningful indicator, both of the gaps that persist, but also of the potential for change. And in this regard, emphasis was placed on the fact that children need, of course, to understand, to trust, to feel confident to use the justice system in its broad sense, but the system needs to be tailored to the expectations, the fears, the concerns of children, and needs to be well-resourced, including with important training of those who participate in it. So in a way, a child-sensitive justice system is required. And in this regard, there were 5 dimensions that I believe we would like to emphasize. The first one is that children need to be informed about their rights, even when they don't think there is any dispute or fear, and how they can ensure their safeguard. This is fundamental to prevent any risks in their lives, including violence, as we heard a moment ago, but also to empower them to feel that it's not a barrier to access any institution that may provide a sense of fairness and justice in their lives. The legal aid for children in Israel was presented. I think one element that I took is there is no wrong door policy, and every opportunity for accessing the system is well taken and needs to be supported. But there were examples about online tools for kids, and we know that children, of course, are great experts in communication information technologies, and this is the means that they usually suggest we should provide information for them. Second element, how important it is to empower children to feel confident and knowledgeable to participate in administrative and judicial proceedings that affect their lives. Of course, a wide range of topics from custody cases, adoption cases, citizenship cases, but also the protection from violence or situations of diversion in the criminal justice system or the promotion of restorative justice. Of course, we could think about all of that. But what is at stake is that children understand what are the possible avenues for solutions, what maybe the risks entail, what may be the consequences, and they are guided in the process rather than being told what the process needs to mean for them. And they also need to understand what are the roles and responsibilities of the actors and institutions with whom they engage, who is best placed to support and who can provide the right information at the right time. And this implies, of course, the need for children to benefit from legal information, legal aid, and legal representation with the view to enabling the child to be heard in a genuine and effective manner. Third dimension, the importance of ensuring a child-friendly environment for the child, starting with the fact that all situations should be guided by the best interests of the child, and of course criteria to understand how you identify that for every child at every moment is important, including in training of those who participate in decisions. The environment needs to be physically close and accessible to children, close if we think about rural, remote areas, but also accessible for children with disabilities or others, of course, just to give some examples. The importance of having non-biased attitudes and non-dismissive attitudes by those who provide the right answers or guidance to children, and those who need to be having the right skills and the right training, including through a multidisciplinary engagement, to be open to listen to the child and to clearly create the environment where the child can say what the child feels without fear of reprisal. Fourth element, a system that children need to trust. And in this regard, of course, emphasis was placed on the risk of re-victimization of children and the risk of fragmentation of services, and how important it is, as we heard from the Barnehuse experience in the Nordic countries, that services come to the child and the child is not forced to tell a story over and over again, over time, before different institutions. leading the child to believe that his perception of what happened has been distorted and certainly suffering the consequences. But secondly, that there is a swift decision. The sense of time we emphasize in our discussion for a child is very different of what it means for an adult, and therefore we need to have decisions that make a sense and do not become an eternity for the child. And the final point, a system that is transparent and is ready to evaluate and to make public the evaluation of how effective and impactful and meaningful it is for children and young people. And in this regard, engaging with young people in that evaluation is very important, including those who have been involved with the justice system, but they need to have the feedback of what their contribution has been, and they need to feel that there is openness to introduce the changes required for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Speaking about children and young people is speaking about our future, so important. Gail, what about indigenous communities' main points? Which is the main result of your session?
Okay. All right. Indigenous communities, we had two wonderful presentations from Juanita Lopez from Colombia and Janet McIntyre from the Department of Justice Canada, but let me say there were two limitations apart from the wonderful presentations. The first one was there were no Indigenous people there, and that's the first thing that if we're going to discuss Indigenous communities, we must have Indigenous communities engaged, and I'll touch more on that later. The second is that no one else came either, and so there were just the three of us. But that means we had a very productive conversation, and I'll cover that in a moment as well. It was disappointing because, in fact, the story of Indigenous communities is really one of European colonisation and dispossession and actually, in fact, the very effective use of the law to subjugate and oppress and so forth. In the case of New Zealand, in the case of Australia and Canada, to remove children from families and so forth. So actually, the law has been very effective for many years, so the challenges are there caused by that. But with Canada and with Colombia, there were two different approaches, which was interesting. Colombia has, with its many different Indigenous communities, about 102, has gone down the path in their constitution in 1991 of devolving a lot of responsibility in relation to their own justice systems and the conduct of justice to the communities. The challenges are, of course, the practical implementation of that in a whole range of ways, and in terms of do they even know what all is happening in the communities? What about trying to be culturally appropriate in services that are delivered? What about practices such as underage marriage of women and so forth? So there's a whole range of practical implementations, what works, what doesn't. We'll touch on that shortly as well. I didn't talk about Australia, but Janet spoke about Canada, and you can pretty much say whatever happens in Canada happens in Australia because it's almost identical. We certainly have not cracked it, and Canada, I think, hasn't cracked it in a sense that enormous Indigenous challenges, Indigenous overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, in terms of child protection, removal of children from families, Indigenous children are way, way overrepresented. And so we have not found the solutions. And there is a lot of, I won't go through the details, the numbers that Janet gave us, but they really are quite shocking if you aren't aware of them, and they're very similar in Australia. Which raises a number of issues and challenges, and I guess we then came up with what the OECD can do going forward, and what we can do going forward. And I'll just say before I go on that we had a vote, and these are all unanimous decisions. The first thing was that Indigenous people must be involved in whatever we do in discussions about this going forward. So that just goes out there. And it was a particular point made by Canada. In relation to Colombia, there's a whole range of issues, and this goes broadly into what works. And they would like assistance in how to coordinate, how to implement the issues of how do you have two parallel justice systems in a way. And does it work, and what bits work and what doesn't, and what works in what circumstances. But overall, I think what we lack in the whole issue of Indigenous communities, apart from involving Indigenous people at this point, is the whole issue of the what works question again. and what works effectively, what works cost effectively and culturally appropriately in the circumstances. And on all the evidence, this is probably the one group that we are failing most, certainly in my country and probably in Canada and others. And so if there is a high priority for work on looks at areas of what work, and it's a difficult one, this is one. And so we had a vote and decided that there should be a new OECD stream of work that would include possibly the three of us, but certainly at least three, if not more, Indigenous people. And that given this all stemmed from European colonisation, that the EU should fund it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. So now it is time for listening from the MENA OECD working group, which is, also traveling for a long time on the topics of rule of law and regulation. So please, the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Dans le cadre de notre groupe de travail, nous avons entendu les différentes perspectives de plusieurs pays sur la réforme de la réglementation et l'état de droit. Nous avons parlé essentiellement de 4 thèmes: l'amélioration de la réglementation et l'accès à la justice grâce à un langage simple, à l'accès à l'information et à l'autonomisation juridique. Les participants ont mis l'accent sur l'approche participative dans l'élaboration des textes juridiques et sur la transparence. Le deuxième thème portait sur le renforcement de l'autonomie juridique et de l'accès à la justice pour les PME. Les différents intervenants ont insisté ici sur le fait que faciliter l'accès à la justice des PME conduit à la réduction des délais de recours devant les juridictions et à combattre la corruption et notamment à booster aussi l'économie. Le troisième thème portait sur le rapprochement de la justice à la population grâce à l'utilisation de la technologie. Et les participations ont tous adhéré à l'intérêt qu'apporte la nouvelle technologie à la propulsion de la facilitation de l'accès à la justice. Enfin, le dernier thème portait sur l'accès à la justice pour les groupes vulnérables de la région MENA, notamment les femmes, les jeunes et les enfants. En fait, tous les participants ont démontré un très grand intérêt pour les questions abordées, notamment la facilitation de l'accès à la justice pour toutes les catégories des personnes. Ils sont tous d'accord pour continuer l'expérience et de s'échanger les informations à ce sujet afin de faciliter l'accès à la justice à toutes les personnes vulnérables et aux PME. Je vous remercie.
Before leaving the floor to Tatiana on building the case for access to justice, I wanted just to highlight 4 words that seems to me extremely important, and they are quite recurrent. Responsiveness, barriers versus gaps, friendly environment for a person coming from indigenous communities, but friendly environment, and the quality of the rules, quality of the framework in which we are basically operating. So now, building a case for access to justice.
Thank you, Daniela. Our breakout session considered both the findings of the OECD white paper on building the business case as well as the way forward. So in terms of the key findings, not to repeat a number of elements that were discussed in the past 2 days, but what we saw is that legal problems are ubiquitous. They happen much more frequently than we may anticipate. So it's important to start being much more conscious about this issue, that disadvantaged groups are much more likely to experience legal problems, and that these problems can also have severe consequences, both for the lives of the individuals, but then also for societies at large, and the overall cost of these problems can amount, from from 0.5 percentage point of the GDP to 3 percentage points in some of the countries. Legal capability is also low for many people who are experiencing these legal problems. So we also looked in the white paper on what can be done in closing the remaining gaps, and actually what works in closing what gaps for what groups of people and for what types of problems. There are 4 main types of interventions that we've looked at, including, first of all, specific interventions related to legal aid, legal support, legal assistance, and that we need to differentiate the impact of legal representation to unbundled assistance, to other types of support that is provided, and to really start being granular about what works for whom and when. Interventions related to supporting vulnerable groups and specific issues that they may be facing. Interventions related to prevention of violence, as well as legal empowerment and legal literacy interventions that can also lead to the improvements in governance and the quality of laws and rules that govern our societies. Of course, we acknowledge that this white paper has many limitations, and it's just a starting point. And this brings me to actually what can be done as a way forward to improve the business case and strengthen the evidence. We had 3 mini panels focusing on the improvements in the quality of the data to measure the costs of lack of access. So here the main points were that we need to also expand the scope to understand what are the costs of different types of gaps in enforcing rights, such as maybe lack of access to legal identity. So how can we quantify that? A second point is that we need to be investing systematically and continuously in data and evidence. So, and we can be inspired by the experience in other sectors in this area. But then also we really need to deepen country-level data collection and analysis, and really start becoming much more granular in terms of telling individual country stories. So when in the second kind of mini panel, we looked at what can be done to strengthen our understanding of the benefits of different interventions. And I guess one conclusion that stems from that discussion is actually almost repeating what Jeff just said, that we need to invest in understanding what works in strengthening legal capability, what works in strengthening access to information, what works in eliminating violence against women, and in providing child-centered responses. So it's really looking at it much more holistically, but also building on robust evidence, and yes, looking at multiple types of interventions. We need to maximize the use of the different types of data that is available. Of course, legal needs surveys provide an important starting point, but then also how can we start using much more explicitly administrative data and other data available in different sectors. How can we bring together other social sectors such as health and education, and also show the relevance of legal problems in those areas. And then finally, for the indicators. So we've looked at levels, well, it's different efforts to start thinking about the indicators at the national level. We've looked at the efforts in Colombia to develop a whole of government approach to measuring access to justice, but also what it means in different sectors. We saw the experience of National Statistical Agency in actually strengthening capacity to measure access to civil justice, also within the given constraints, but then also something that is relatively important and can present itself as an opportunity for this community is a potential opening at the global level to reflect on the framework for monitoring sustainable development goals, and the possibility of introducing a new indicator on access to civil justice. So there will be a revision process, and so this may be, again, an opportunity for this community to think of whether a new indicator can be proposed in that context. I know I'm out of time, so thank you.
So thank you very much. This is not the end, it's a start. As you have understood, we now need to build a bridge to, the Agenda 2030, as we know. I think all the panelists and all people that have contributed to the discussion during these days. And you keep your seat. We need just 2 minutes to change the main panel, and then we will have the final session. Thank you very much.
afternoon. So we have the privilege of having Minister of Presidency and Administration Modernization, Mariana Vieira da Silva, for the closing session, together with Ministra Francesca Van Dunem and Secretary Annabella Pedroso. So I would just, before giving the floor to Ministra Vieira da Silva, I hope I pronounced correctly, just would like to say a few words on behalf of the OECD. First of all, to thank everybody for being here during these 2 days in this beautiful palace, but also keeping in mind that we are in a beautiful city with a beautiful weather, but nevertheless, you stayed with us during these 2 days. I found that the exchanges we had were particularly enriching because I think the setting of sharing country experiences with different approaches, different innovations, is really very, very precious, especially at current times where a lot of countries are trying to reform their judicial system, bringing innovation, bringing new technologies, and of course being in Portugal for this was particularly meaningful as I think, were all impressed by the great progress made by our host country in this sector, thanks to the Minister and to Annabella. I think now, I don't want to summarize anything and come up with some broad principles, because I think the beauty of this type of meeting is that probably each one of you pick and choose what you find most interesting in other countries' experience, and then recreate your own good practice when you go back home and invent new things, probably, I would say, fertilized by what you hear being tried out in other countries. So just a few very practical matters regarding the next steps. We will be sending to all participants the PowerPoints. I think they were really excellent. We had excellent presentations. And when doing that, we will circulate a feedback form also to have your ideas for the next roundtable. In terms of topics, we touched upon many topics, many trade-offs between the territorial aspect and the access, how to empower citizens and make them actors of the system, all these issues that we start to elaborate together, but I think would require more in-depth analysis. The team will also prepare a simple summary of the discussions, so that we can also all keep some trace of the very rich discussions that we had. On the OECD side, we will continue working on the business case, on indicators, on gathering experiences, good policy experiences, and we will be happy to share that with you. Just also to explain that in the OECD setting, we work under the leadership of the Public Governance Committee. Sorry to get a little bit in the bureaucratic aspects of the OECD. And so we will be informing our committee of the interest that member countries show for the work on equal access to justice. Finally, let me thank the team, Tatiana, Chloe, Martina, and Roman. I'm sorry to say that now before giving the floor to the Minister, but it's important to me, and I really appreciate the work that the team has been doing. And finally, I would like to thank Portugal for, again, hosting us in such a nice and friendly way. Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Your Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be with you on the occasion of this 5th OECD Global Policy Roundtable on Equal Access to Justice. I would like to start by thanking you for your kind invitation and for the opportunity to share some of our goals and initiatives concerning administrative modernization. Innovation and knowledge are distinguished factors and engines of growth and progress, especially today. And this is also true for the public sector. But let me blunt about one thing. The modernization process should never be a goal in itself. Our main purpose is to provide the best public services to our citizens. By fulfilling this objective, public services themselves benefit from this process by improving their own organization and efficiency. And it is encouraging to know that in the most diverse sectors, there is a dynamic and a willingness to contribute with innovative solutions that improve the lives of our citizens. That is precisely what has been discussed during the past 2 days regarding access to justice, a field where innovation has played a major role in promoting equality and in making people's lives simpler and thus better. Portugal has been at the forefront of digital administrative modernization programs for quite some time now. We started off by focusing on gaining efficiency within our administration, and we are now in the process of designing the next generation of co-created and anticipatory public services for citizens and companies. Regarding public administration, the contribution of companies and civil society has been critical for the creation and development of solutions that meet the real needs and expectations of the users of public services, our citizens. However, we do not let ourselves be deceived. When the government's top-down political impetus weakens, public structures and entities may become increasingly averse to change and more conservative. Thus, the effort to modernize and to simplify, which must be continuous, might be lost, and we cannot let that happen. That is the reason why we have promoted the sharing of ideas and experiences among public administration agents and those who directly deal with the state. Simplex Plus is the emblematic example of this dynamic. The umbrella Simplex program, launched in 2005, marked the beginning of a virtuous transformative cycle based on simplify before digitalizing, and to use digitalization as a key enabler of legislative and administrative simplification. Also during this time, the justice area was fundamental in the much needed push for simplifying citizens' lives. That will become very clear for 2 significant projects in that field. The company on the spot focused on making the entrepreneur's path simpler, and the CITIUS platform, an initiative of dematerialization of judicial cases. By listening to civil servants, companies, and citizens, we were able to develop a progressively more participative, more efficient, and more innovative program. Today, there are more than 200 projects in Simplex Plus 2018, with very significant part of them involving the use of ICTs and resulting in new digital services for citizens and businesses. The Simplex program is now a hallmark representing not just public service simplification, but also a new culture of participation, collaboration, and trust between public administration and citizens. In 2018, Simplex has reached all aspects of citizens' lives, going from the universal and free access to the official journal and the possibility to read the summaries in legislation in clear language in order to allow everyone to better understand the applicable law and their rights and their duties. To sum up, to allow our citizens to lead a more participative and informed life. In the area of justice, as you now may know, we can highlight new innovative measures: the online civil registration certificate, the online criminal record, and the creation of an electronic notification system to ensure that our citizens' documents are always up to date. Furthermore, we have created measures such as the automatic income tax returns, the electronic health registration, or the paperless prescription, which save time and money, both to our citizens and to our services. As I mentioned before, our goal is to serve our citizens better. We cannot be mesmerized by all the digital glitter. In Portugal, we have recognized the need to include those who are less proficient in the digital arena and fully adhere to this no citizens left behind principle. That is why we have launched a comprehensive digital skills initiative named InCode 2030, built upon 5 main axes: inclusion, education, qualification, specialization, and research. Inclusion is absolutely essential to ensure that all citizens have the digital skills to be fully included in the present-day society. Regarding the public administration, we rely on the qualification axis to improve digital skills of our public officials. Without those skills, we will not be able to further proceed in the digital transformation process. Also, we need to be prepared to take advantage of the technological innovations that emerge every day, such as cloud computing, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and big data, to name just a few. That is why, in the public administration, we need to take advantage of our research and development ecosystem. Among the many technological innovations I've just referred to, we are paying particular attention to those related with data, big data, data science, and artificial intelligence. We all know public administrations everywhere collect, store, and manage significant amount of data as part of their normal functioning. Administrative data for every citizen and business is collected from birth to death. How can we use the administrative data combined with data from other sources to better inform our public policies and decision-making process, and to change from reactive paradigm to an anticipatory service provision paradigm? No doubt this will have a big impact on public sector digital transformation processes. To take advantage of this data, we need very specialized skills and knowledge, which are in short supply in public administration and in high demand even in the private sector. This is one of the main challenges we face. That is why we have been promoting partnerships between public entities and research centers from our academia. Let me give you some examples of what we are doing in this area. Predict public services demand peaks and help design and the response to accommodate them. Identify the degree of risk of every new unemployed citizen to become long-term unemployed. Characterize skill gaps and design specific preventive interventions. Identify patterns of possible fraud in several social security benefits and therefore make sample inspections smarter. This kind of innovative approach must be prototyped and in order to minimize risks without losing creativity. That is why we launched LabX, our public administration experimentation laboratory, a place to experiment and prototype new solutions to involve public officials, citizens, and entrepreneurs in service design process to combine traditional tools with ICT field and new sciences and skills such as ergonomics or behavioral sciences. Like so many other countries who went down this digital transformation road, we had to overcome several obstacles, but I think we achieved, as you've seen today and yesterday, some successes. If the government is responsible for developing public policies that contribute to sustainable development, it is up to us to do it involving the most innovative companies, universities, and sectors of our society. Most importantly, it is essential to share our experiences and learn from others how to avoid repeating past mistakes. Initiatives such as this policy roundtable we are closing today are of crucial importance in improving our citizens' lives. We are thankful for being able to share our experience and cooperate with other countries in order to reach their goal. Thank you very much.
I'm encouraged to say au revoir, but so thank you. The roundtable is so now closed, and thank you again for participating and for contributing to the discussions, and I hope you have a safe journey back home. Bye-bye.